Hi, today we're going to talk about The Aztec Treasure House by Evan S. Connell Jr. Evan S. Connell Jr. Was a fine writer. He's gone now from the 1950s up to about 2005. He was an active writer. He never had a deep popular success. The closest would probably be a book he wrote in the 1980s called Son of the Morning Star, which was a history book about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And a couple of his novels were adapted into a film starring Paul Newman, which, isn't bad. But still, he did not have like one book or one work or one character that really made it deeply into the literary imagination, into the literary circle of his time. I believe he worked as a employment advisor, one of those people that helps other people try to find jobs. And he didn't try to make a living off of his writing because he wanted to be free to write the stuff that he wanted to. And one of the things that he wanted to write was musings, little historical and literary essays about unusual bits of human history. And they eventually pulled them together into a book called The Aztec Treasure House. Originally, these were two other books. One was called The Long Desire, and the other was called The White Lantern. And they were written as books of musings. Normally, when you get these little books of essays, they're collections of the author's work that's appeared in periodicals, maybe sometimes with one or two new pieces, but it's kind of like, how can I squeeze another dime out of work that I've already written? I know, we'll collect it into a book and see if people are willing to buy it. They're usually not very successful, but usually someone's interested. These are actually some of my favorite kinds of books because I don't like to read magazines and periodicals that much, but I do like it when it's by an author I like. So I will look for these books, and then I can just read all of their kind of ancillary nonfiction in one go. But this was not that. Connell's books were written as books, like the pieces are meant to go together, and each book forms a modest narrative. They have connections to each other, thematic if nothing else. And they're very fun. He's an excellent writer. His sense of sentence structure and prose and making it simple to follow, complex ideas and hold large casts of characters, some of whom we've never heard of before, in history together, is very strong. He can do a lot with a little. So for him to turn his attention to these topics is fun because this is what I would call like exotic history. This is fun history. This is not the history of textbooks. This is like narrative history where stuff is set in a story so that it will hold in your mind, and with lots of little telling details, lots of those touches that are real and accurate, and that focused on them sort of bring out something of the sense of what Connell's trying to show you. So, just for example, when I say fun exotic history, I mean, this isn't like the role of the plow in the development of Low Country economics, 1500 to 1680. This is like, where the hell did we get the idea of Atlantis? Where did that come from? What is it about? Antarctica. How did we ever get the idea to explore there? Why does no one live there? What were those like? It's a lot of exploring history, exploration, people setting off into the unknown and encountering it for the first time. This is one of the common threads to all the stories. What about treasure? Was there ever buried treasure? Where did it come from? Who sought it? How did it get there? Lost languages, peoples about whom we know very little, like the Etruscans, early human history. How did we come to know that there have been different species of primates like us around on Earth for, well more than 1 million years? How did that knowledge grow? Who found it? What about those people who just sort of went on long trips for no seemingly deep reason? Marco Polo and other people who are not as well known in the U.S., like Ibn Battuta, the great North African traveler of the 13th and 14th centuries. Connell is not a scholar, but he's obviously read scholarship, and then he's able to sort of summarize and condense for you and distill these, big stories down to a handful of pages, and then put them next to each other and give a sort of resonance between the pieces. So, for example, part of the Aztec Treasure House, several of the little essays sort of follow the medieval Christian European encounter with Asia on its sort of fantastical side. So he'll move from, say, the Crusades and the myth of Prester John, who was a Christian king supposedly of great power and wealth somewhere in Asia, who medieval Christians were at least interested in maybe finding if he was real, because that would be very important to them. Then, the Portuguese attempts to get around Africa and reach India, Columbus, the conquistadors. There's this kind of steady contact between these, what was at the time a fairly small civilization on the scale of the world, the sort of Christian European civilization, and everything else. How did they expand their concept of the world, and what did they do when they encountered all of these other people? So that's one of the main themes of the book. The second, I don't mean to imply there's only two. Another is the disconnect between the ideals of Christianity and the actual behavior of Christian colonialists, which is a huge ongoing issue in the world. And Connell brings it out mostly with a kind of a sigh and it was always like this sort of, he's very resigned. He's not angered deeply by these facts. He notes them as like the horrible things that the conquistadors did to Native Americans, the birth of the slave trade, the general devaluation of anyone who wasn't a white Christian. He notes these, and he notes especially, you get the feeling that this is a big issue for him. He notes the justifications for cruelty advanced by these people, by people like popes who have to justify the unbelievable cruelties of crusaders and conquistadors, by kings and princes and their captains who have to justify the cruelty of their men to the people that they encounter. He often quotes from them. And when you're writing history, when you quote first-person sources, when you actually quote the sources that you are relying upon, that gives you a good idea of what that historian considers most important, because the move to the first-person source is often like the last move in a line of argument in history. Connell's move is something along the lines of, the powerful are liars now and always, and whatever trick of it in the human psyche that allows people to do horrible things and then either justify them, say, yes, these are horrible, but we have a reason, or deny that they're horrible. These are the kind of people who tend to rise to the top of our institutions. Connell also wrote two very long, epic poems. They're both book length, and they're quite good. And a major theme in those poems as well is the hypocrisy of Europe and the European colonial project. He sort of comes at the matter differently than Conrad, because Connell has more sympathy with the peoples who the Europeans encountered, and is really drawn to try to understand and to look through the pieces of history that he can access. This book, Aztec Treasure House, is about 40 years old, and a lot of the sources that flesh out pre-Columbian people's experience, I assume, were not that available to Connell. So much work's been done in this line in the last 40 years. If you were to write him today, I imagine it would be different, because he's more focused on what we don't know about these people, whereas now I think that could be redressed. We don't know as little as his essays seem to imply about who they were and what they believed and what their works meant to us. But he's very focused on what was lost. So there are long passages about the great artworks of the Incan Empire, for example, which had to be hidden from the conquistadors and might still be out there. There are a long passage, particularly memorable, about the Spanish bishop Diego de Landa, who, before he destroyed almost every single Mayan book and artifact in creation, thousands of books, just a complete, almost complete immolation of a culture, did take the trouble to ask a Mayan prince for a glossary and an alphabet for the Mayan language, which has helped modern scholars to decipher a lot of what remains, the stuff that Delanda couldn't get to, like glyphs that were carved in stone and not so easily destroyed. Oh, but boy, that one breaks the heart. I believe, I looked into this once, and I believe there are literally only 4 Mayan books left in the world. For a long time it was thought there were only 3, and then about 100 years ago someone just randomly found one in some collection or some archive in Spain, and now there are only 4. But we know from the descendants of the Mayan from records of the time, there were thousands, maybe tens of thousands of these just gorgeous sort of, they weren't like our books that were like pages of paper turned. They were more like continuous scrolls, the kinds that folded out, sort of like those art books from Japan that eventually formed like a screen of paper. And when you look at how beautiful the Mayan carvings are and the Mayan glyphs, I don't know, I think it makes Egypt look lame. I've always found ancient Egypt aesthetically and stylistically just kind of dull. I told people once this, and I inadvertently provoked just like gales of laughter. I don't know why. Maybe it's weird to have that opinion at all. Maybe that was it. It's like people didn't expect a strong opinion about ancient Egypt, but I swear. And I've studied hieroglyphs, and I've read about it. You gotta know about it if you study human society, but I swear to God, with small exceptions for some of the stories and some of the poetry, I look at their art and I just think this is just boring. There isn't any of that tension or aspiration that I'm feeling. I don't get the people who obsess about Egypt or make up like metaphysical nonsense about pyramid power. I don't get it. It's just dull to me. I mean, the antiquity is amazing, and of course it's great that the climate allowed us to know so much about these people, and Egyptology was basically the testing ground for modern archaeological principles, and I get all of that, but I also just think what they left behind is dull. it's boring. It speaks of just kind of like power and oppression and a society of like fixed roles. They're not alone in being dull. There are others, like, oh God, what, those monuments of Sargon that are just like, yeah, they're monumental and impressive, but dang, naked power is just boring, or at least I find it so. Maybe this is why I can't like the movie Scarface very much. Anyway, back to Connell. Okay, so you have these very well written little historical essays about usually the encounters of people who come from the same cultural background as Connell, a European Christian, white, although the concept white didn't really exist at the time that he was talking about this, but that sort of background and their encounters with other peoples. And Connell is usually quite resigned and skeptical about the cruelty involved and regrets the loss of so much. And this is where we get to the concept of the exotic. I think I called his essays earlier exotic history, and this idea of exotic cultures, which pops up over and over again in Western literature. The site of the actual exoticness changes over time, just on the sort of the movements of the culture. But there's always a sense of somewhere out there, things are different. Things are more strange and desirable and unreal and filled with sort of twirling unknowns. This is language that Connell uses in these essays too. Obviously, one of the books was called A Long Desire, and partly what he writes about is that sort of unnameable impulse to go somewhere else and see other things, which seems to have inspired quite a lot of the people that he writes about. They can't always explain why they have to go. In fact, a lot of us can't really articulate why we do what we have to do. We learn phrases that put people off and sort of close the question, but can you really, can you really explain why you do what you have to do? I remember once watching a TV show and they were talking to a guy who ran a hair salon, and they asked him, he cared very much about hair and he charged a lot. He was like a master stylist. Forgive me, I forget his name. I don't think it was Vidal Sassoon. But they were asking him, isn't this kind of silly to put this much in hair? And he just said, I don't think so. He's like, I love this and it's what I'm good at and I care about it. And that's about it. There's not much else to say. It pulls you out there to continually seek some kind of new horizon, even if it's just like a new way of cutting hair, some sort of new horizon that yanks you out of the familiar and sends you off into the unknown. And one form of that desire is exoticness. And the exotic is a concept I'm sort of still struggling with because it can mean so many different things. But at least as it's used in Connell's work, it takes on a lot of qualities that should be familiar to a lot of people from the United States. And it winds up seeming honestly kind of sinister and unhelpful, potentially dangerous. So in order to talk about that, I just have to talk about Connell's other books real quick. Connell's other books, he has a lot, and there are two novels based on his own life growing up in Kansas City in the 1930s and 40s. Connell came from a what we might call an upper middle class background. His father was a professional. His mother was a homemaker, and they had sort of that kind of country club style existence. And he chronicles that life really extraordinarily well in these two novels, which are organized in the forms of like little vignettes. They are roughly chronological, but they don't start and end in the style of traditional novels, which is a strength for them. They just add an immense amount of tone and detail and really evoke that world of a sort of conservative country club, upper middle class United States existence. And there's a bunch of features to these, to that world. There are a bunch of features to that particular brand of conservatism that Connell brings out really well, and that I think inform his idea of what is exotic. One is no sex. That's a big one. There's no sexuality in that world openly on display. Everything is left subdued. It's never talked about. It's not flaunted. It is sort of acknowledged to exist silently by its pressure and by the taboos that surround it. There's a very good passage in one of the books where there is this family, the Bridges. There's Mr. Bridge, there's Mrs. Bridge, there's two daughters and a son. And the son really leaps off the page and I think is very clearly informed by Connell's experience himself, learning sort of the codes of his tribe. And there's a very good bit where Mrs. Bridge discovers that her son has some of these kind of naughty postcards that were like the best you could do if you wanted to look at topless people in the 30s, because Playboy didn't exist yet. And she doesn't panic or anything, but there's this kind of surge of, oh my gosh, what do I do? What do I do? I can't, do I take them? Do I not? Do I take them? And she eventually kind of punts on the whole issue. And what she does do, though, is she goes up to the attic and she digs out, as though it's like some kind of mysterious, dangerous artifact. She digs out this book. It's like a tiny little booklet called like The Birds and the Bees. And it's from like 1910. And she leaves it on her son's, like tucked under his sheet, where he'll be sure to find it, but no one else will, and it won't be visible. And it's just this wonderful image of this kind of very cloistered attitude towards sexuality that governs their world. there's another excellent bit where at one point someone gives them a gift of a book of like Hindu temple art, not knowing that there are pictures in the book of topless statues. And when they find this out, they can't get rid of the book because they value the person who give this, but they like put it way up high on the bookshelf where no one can just casually bring it down. It's great. The book is full of like little telling details like that. So that's one thing. No sex. Number two is no blood, no violence, nothing dirty, and blood is very dirty. So the boy, whose name eludes me for the moment, maybe it'll come to me. The Evan S. Connell stand-in character in the book has this BB gun, and he's living out some like Davy Crockett style fantasies, something he heard on the radio show, and he actually uses it to shoot a squirrel on purpose. He wants to, and he wants to then take the squirrel and skin it. He's gonna like do that with his Boy Scout knife, and he's going to like keep the squirrel skin as like maybe just a squirrel skin. Maybe he'll turn it into a hat. He doesn't even know. He's just drawn to it, is the point. He's drawn to something kind of bloody, and his father can feel there's this great scene where through just like silent tension his dad can feel how unacceptable this is to everyone else in the household, that he would do this. And it's like a combination of classism and sort of concern for the squirrel or any other animals that this kid might feel like killing with his BB gun. But on a deeper level, it's this concern for sort of exposing what life is really about. You know, exposing that animalism, fleshy, bloody things that is just unacceptable in this world. In this world, things are pleasant. This is like a kind of more staid Pleasantville. Things are pleasant. Things are clean. Goods are renewed regularly. Lawns are mowed. The organic world is kept where it needs to be, under control. and this kid killing the squirrel, it is not out of line. So it's not just that they have to convince him, and the father does. He puts all of his paternal pressure behind it, and convinces the kid not to shoot any more animals, but also that now what do we do with the squirrel? Well, the squirrel, you know, they could do a lot of things with it, but they eventually decide as his sort of penance for killing it in the first place, he has to bury it. He has to bury the squirrel in the backyard or something. And he can sort of feel the wrongness of this, the boy, I mean. He resists, but not very hard. He's too young to formally resist, and he doesn't yet know how to articulate what's at stake. But one of the themes of the books is he has a sense that his life is being constrained by the expectations of the world around him, but he doesn't know how to explain it to himself yet, and he hasn't tried out all the taboos. So he just moves on to the next one. He keeps trying things, this kid. He's great. He keeps trying things that are available for him to do and that he has not yet discovered you just don't do. And then when he does discover you don't do, he doesn't really rebel. He just kind of moves on to the next one, and he quietly keeps his own counsel. That kind of sums up Connell's approach to worldly history. He's not a rebel, but he quietly keeps his own opposition to himself, kind of like a secret. And every now and then lets on that he knows, with sort of like a wink and a sigh, that things should not be this way. Conquistadors should not decimate native populations. Governments should not lie to their citizens. Generals should not pretend to know what's going on when they clearly don't and get a lot of people killed. But he's very quiet. And ultimately, it's a reasonably deferential attitude to power. So getting back to the exotic. The exotic to Connell is sex. The exotic is blood and violence. The exotic is things like different clothes than you're used to seeing people wear, uh, different sorts of attitudes towards fundamental realities like dirt and sex and blood and food, and these are all these confirm what you consider non-exotic as sort of normal. I see Connell as a great armchair traveler. He might have been a real traveler too, and I bet he went places that were as unlike where he came from as he could possibly get to. Um, Places that where people lived what he saw as dramatically different lives, and that seems to inform the kind of history he wants to write. He wants to write the history that's out on the edges, you know. So even though like the key events of history are not these little scraps of, you know, strange moments in human life, or these little bits of exploration, or these travelers, these eccentrics wandering around uncovering puzzles that no one else really cares about, that's where Connell wants to be. Because if you're fundamentally deferential to power and you can't rebel against it or build a historical thesis that will work against it, then often the best you can do is just seek out the strange and the unusual. Because power doesn't care about those very much. There's lots of stuff that powerful institutions that want to turn things to bad ends just ignores, because it doesn't see them as a threat and it doesn't see them as an opportunity, and so it just ignores them. If it happens to look like they might be a threat or opportunity, obviously it will take an interest. But in general, I mean, powerful groups and institutions just don't care about the Etruscans. It doesn't mean anything to anybody historically. Perhaps somewhere in Italy there's someone who it means something to. No one cares if the Harappan language, this undeciphered symbol language from these ancient amulets that were found in India, does anyone really care if they're deciphered or not? Even if they were, what will we learn? At one point, Connell's writing about Columbus, and he mentions how Columbus took a second copy of his log, the ship's log on the first voyage, and he put it in a watertight barrel and he threw it overboard. And ever since then, people have thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if someday someone just found it? I mean, it's been destroyed, but there have been multiple forgeries over the years, some of which were successful because people just want to find this thing so much. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You know, what matters is the impact of the exchange that Columbus began. It's not like the specific book, this specific icon or fetish that could be found. Even if it did reveal some details or something, it's not that vital. If you're fundamentally deferential and skeptical towards power, but deferential about it ultimately, then you often wind up looking in these areas where power is at least kind of distant. You might point out occasionally where it has raised its head. You might point out some commonalities between the eras of the past and the eras of today. Like one of Connell's essays talks about the Swedish battleship the Vasa. This is a story that fascinated me when I first heard about it. I think I was 8, and it was in one of those kind of National Geographic books for kids about famous shipwrecks. And I just thought this story is amazing. I will summarize it quickly. In 1628, King Gustavus Adolphus, who was one of the most successful warrior kings of Europe, ordered a new battleship to be built, and he took a great interest in its construction. And so it was. And it was the largest battleship in Europe, and it was going to be sent into the Baltic to help them fight the Poles. This was a time when Sweden was tough, badass guys. Like, they had a little empire and so on and so on. Anyway, this thing is built. There are some warnings. It's built to look really fancy. It has lots of, like, intricate woodwork and, you know, like a dragon or a lion for the prow to like strike terror into the enemies and stuff. And it sets off from Stockholm, and like the whole town is watching it set out. This thing cost an entire year of the king's budget to build a ship back then, which tells you, you know, when you look at what the Pentagon spends, not much has changed, right? And then it gets literally a mile. It doesn't even get out of sight of anybody before a gust of wind comes over and just knocks it right on its butt. Just knocks it right over. and it sinks. They set out with rowboats to rescue as many people as they can, but still something like 50 people drown, and it's lost. They salvage some of the cannon, but then the location of the boat is just forgotten, even though it's right there in Stockholm Harbor. And then hundreds of years later, this guy takes an interest and spends years of his life pulling junk up from Stockholm Harbor, just immense amounts of garbage. And finally, though, he finds it, and the Swedes confirm it, and they spend a few years figuring out how to raise it safely without it destroying. And now it has like its own museum and has become like this national symbol. There's probably an amazing story in the decision making about what the heck to do with it once they raised it, and how to market it and what kind of role it plays in Swedish nationalism. But the bigger point was just the chutzpah of these guys. And so Connell goes and he looks in. They did have a trial after the shipwreck to figure out what happens, or an inquiry. And they talk to all the relevant people involved, and it keeps coming out. Essentially, the king wanted it built this way, and no one wanted to tell him no. Nobody wanted to tell the king this was a bad idea because this is what the king wanted. Now, to anybody who's lived through the Trump administration, this should sound deadly familiar. And of course the inquiry was shut down, and no one in particular was charged, and it was all just kind of shoved down the memory hole, so that God did it, act of God, couldn't be helped, no one responsible, no one charged. So how do you hold how do you hold the king responsible? Now, Connell wrote this before Trump, but he does draw a parallel here with Vietnam. Connell had been in the Navy during World War II and followed the Vietnam saga. He writes about it in some of his other poems, and his contempt for the powerful people who just allowed this fiasco to continue and continue, and for all the lives lost because of that, does come through. Those sections of his work are when he's least deferential to power. Maybe the Times sort of emboldened him a bit, but even there, he tends to let people off the hook with a sort of "'twas ever thus" kind of attitude. Oh yes, government is led by people who are sometimes villainous and incompetent. Hey, what else is new? Well, let's move on. There is not that true outrage or that true determination to not let things like this happen again in Connell's work, which show up in the work of, say, Percy Shelley, or coded show up in the work of, say, Kurt Vonnegut, Connell's contemporary. What shows up instead is A Fleet of the Exotic. And here's where another book of his comes into play. This is really winding up being about all of Connell's work. That's not really a problem. I'm just noting it. I have expanded beyond just the Aztec treasure house. So, Connell writes a novel in the late 70s. I think it came out in 1979, and it's called The Connoisseur. And this is right when he was writing these stories, essays that became the Aztec treasure house. And in The Connoisseur, there is a character, again, like a Connell stand-in, who lives in New York and has a child, and is deeply drawn on a visit to a sort of art and curio shop, to a particular piece, a little pre-Columbian figurine, something from before the European arrival to the Americas. And the course of the book, he doesn't know why he's drawn to these things, but he buys it, and he starts learning about it, and he starts learning about the world of people who trade in such things, and he goes to auctions. And there's no deep character conflict or anything, but at the end he's looking at a piece that he's bought, or he's imagining buying this piece that he's seen. He hasn't actually done it yet, but he's imagining himself buying it and taking it home and putting it on the shelf with his other pieces that he has by now, and just thinking, tell me all the things I need to know. And what the guy needs to know is how to live a better life. They make that reasonably clear. Connell makes that reasonably clear in the book. The guy's looking for a way to live a better life. He's looking for a way to be more at ease, to be more out of his shell. The way he's living now, even though it seems fine in many ways, it's unsatisfactory to him. And this is partly where connoisseurs come from, Connell suggested, or anyone who's like an aficionado of something is. It's a stand-in. It's a substitute for the kind of life they would like to live but can't quite achieve living it. And so instead they collect, because they can achieve collection, they can achieve connoisseurship, they can achieve knowledge, but they can't actually live it out. He can't live out that exotic figure or the culture that made it. He can't be that person. That's too distant. His character is formed. He's an upper middle class kid from Kansas City, and that's just who he is. But he's deeply drawn to this other life and this feeling that something deep in his soul is lacking. And that's the exotic. That right there. That's the pull of the exotic, which again in Connell's case tends to circle around distant places, places outside the norms of your own society, the norms about sex, the norms about violence, about work, about religion, all that stuff that makes you, but also can feel oppressive and burdensome. And you're drawn to it, you're pulled into it, even if it's just to read about it or look at a little figurine made by that culture, or perhaps to go there someday and take a guided tour and maybe see like some dance troupe from the area. You're drawn to it, even if you don't join it, even if you don't live it out, even if you don't incorporate it somehow into your existence. And this is where I say that the exotic in Connell and another drawn to the exotic things is dangerous, is potentially dangerous and somewhat sinister. Is it these are people, right? I mean, the Mayans are people, the Incas are people, the cultures that built the artworks that the protagonist of the Connoisseur enjoys were people. And when you're looking to create advanced humanitarian goals or to achieve deeper human understanding, the exotic can pull you out there and make you want to engage, but it can then become a really serious barrier because you are asking more of those folks and their cultures and their artworks than you're asking, not necessarily more, but you're asking something different from them. You're asking them to put themselves and their art and culture into service of what you lack, of what you feel you're missing. And although in general cultures develop a sort of rhythm to these things, which you can see in sort of the rituals of tourism around the world, where people from different cultures are drawn to places that on some level have that element of the exotic to them, like Hawaii or Jamaica or I don't know what's hot these days, Cancun. You can see how the exotic continues to form part of the pull and the appeal of those places, and how there develops this rhythm where people are given a sort of a safe taste of the exotic, and then they sort of get to go home fundamentally unchanged. And yet we should want the encounters we have with people to change us. That's how we do honor to the value of their existence, is we want it to change us. Yes, we get into a rhythm of it because a certain amount of stability in our lives is desirable, and they don't want it. If we present that to them, then surely, if they present that opportunity for change to us, then surely we present that to them, and all of this can be very intense and terrifying. So, to some extent, the exotic is a safety valve on that possibility by exoticizing people. And I'm sure this works in all sorts of different ways. I'm not saying this is just like a West or a developed world, global South issue anymore. I'm sure it cuts in all sorts of different directions by now, since we're such a connected world. But by exoticizing people, we are people and their art and their culture and their ideas about the world, we are limiting their ability to alter and change our own lives. We are gelding them, so to speak, putting them in a safe box and labeling exotic, fun for a visit, 4 out of 5, would try again. And Connell's history essays in the Aztec Treasure House, the ones that started this talk, are good enough and well thought out enough, and he links his sources together well enough, that I think in general they are productive. They pull people towards learning more about these areas, and they give them background to real issues going on in the real world. Plus, they're just very well done. He's a very good writer, and they're very pleasurable as a reading experience. And the things that he references can lead you to discover more about all of these areas. They're really good. I found they're really good read aloud. I use them as bedtime reading sometimes, and they're just great. But I wanted to point out severely that they do have this element of exoticism to them, which can potentially derail the better possibilities of the general enterprise of learning about history and the wider world, even if it's just through the armchair, even if it's just sitting in your home learning about these things. I think it's good to be aware of the various pressures molding what it is that you're experiencing. Now, Connell's a reasonably honest writer, and he's a very good writer. He doesn't have an agenda. That right there puts him ahead of a lot of potential historical work that does have an agenda. And the fact that he's a good writer puts him ahead of scholars who are often boring. And that right there puts him ahead of a lot of people. He's already jumped maybe 80-90% up the list just with those two very great virtues. And then his selections of material and how to sort of link it together by association, again, keeps him really high up there. But I do think he's vulnerable to charges of exoticism. And knowing that the exotic is waiting to derail the enterprise of learning about the world's history and the world's peoples is very important. It pops up much more in other works. I'm not saying that Connell's like unusually bad in this regard. It's just I like Connell's work, and so I'd rather talk about that than something I don't like. But if you're reading other work, you'll see it happen all the time. There have even been some really clever satires of how, for example, U.S. media reports on kind of foreign cultural stuff, pointing out just how prone to exoticism and making people more or less human and talking about them in a more or less mature way based around this idea of this pull of exoticism. Because this pull of exoticism, you can make a lot of money out of this. You can really make bank. And so it's very easy for media to use it as sort of an initial yank into something else. And it should be mistrusted. It doesn't mean you can't enjoy the touch of the strange and the unusual, but you should watch for when it starts to transmute into something that interferes with your understanding and especially your sympathy. People create things not just for us to enjoy them. And certainly people who lived hundreds of years ago and built whole societies and beautiful works of art, this was not just in order to create some convenient commodity for people to enjoy, even if it's just a series of thoughts and associations in their mind. So, as the exotic pulls us in, we need to be willing to pull back and keep some distance and some sense of what we don't know, which in the long run is a more profitable form of sort of twirling shadows than sort of the cheap pleasures of the exotic.